So I was having an existential crisis this morning, and instead of keeping it to myself like a real man, I decided to be a jerk and share it to all of you. So you know how I made videos on the Gospels and I keep making the same arguments about how they're not really reliable when it comes to telling us what actually happened, and that history needs a more strict discipline and standard for evidence. When I was figuring this all out as a Christian, my mind kept wandering. What if there was a lost gospel written less than 20 years after the death of Jesus? That'll show Bart Ehrman and those secular scholars. Or what if Pilate's secretary wrote about Jesus' trial and the drama that ensued after his death? What if there were other writings about Jesus, but there was only one copy that wasn't preserved? Or it was burnt down, or it was burnt away when Jerusalem was burnt down to the ground by the Romans? What if Paul actually bothered to interview people to know more about Jesus, the human being, instead of just writing about how women should be silent in church? Okay, well, the joke doesn't really work since Paul didn't write Timothy, but nonetheless, there were a few what ifs. These were a few what ifs that I had, all of them being reflections of my frustrations as a student of history for the lack of knowledge we actually have of the past. Even in recent history, this is a problem. In the Philippines, a country in Southeast Asia, the son of former president, dictator, and human rights violator Ferdinand Marcos Jr. was elected president in what was a landslide of a victory. Here's the thing, he was elected democratically by the people, and hearing what a lot of people from the Philippines have to say about his supporters, they seem to contradict one another when it comes to what truly happened during the rule of his father, Marcos Sr., with some even calling Marcos Sr. a hero. It's a reflection of how the Filipinos have possibly forgotten and even lost their own history, forgetting that it was only a few decades ago that they rallied in what is now called the EDSA Revolution, a great display of the power a united country can have against an oppressive force. Think of the phrase, history is written by the winners. Now I know this statement is often used by fascist apologists and like Hitler apologists and whatnot, but the statement is true, right? Think of all the lost Christian groups that became less and less popular over time as the Orthodox view eventually became the most popular. Think of all the religious and cultural groups that were declared heretics and were thus wiped from history. Think of all the civilizations that never wrote anything to tell us about their lives, or if they did have anything, but nothing was preserved. Think of the indigenous tribes and cultures the European colonists wiped out. Think of all the variations of Christianity in the early centuries. I mean, for a very long time, the only thing we knew from Gnostic Christianity, which is not actually a branch but rather a kind of umbrella term for a different school of thought. Think of how for a very long time the only thing we knew about Gnostics is that they were heretics who ate their babies. Imagine if Christianity died out and the only thing we know about them is from the Romans, who wrote about how mysterious and culty they were and how they would sacrifice their own babies. That seems to be a bit of a common theme here. Well, imagine if the only knowledge we got from the Canaanites, Egyptians, or the other enemies of the Israelites was from the Bible, a lot of which we know today aren't really all that true. For a very long time in history, we didn't really know where we came from or what happened in the past, and especially the distant past. Sure, we had stories and myths, but those were nothing more than, well, myths. The book of Genesis even opens up not by saying, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, as we once thought, but rather, when God created the heavens and the earth. My fascination with the Bible was not limited to what it told me, but also to what it didn't tell me. And that was my problem. Curiosity. My constant lust for knowledge.
And that's my weakness. Curiosity.
Truth be told, we, collectively as humans, will never know everything. We will never truly explore the universe, or travel back in time to see if T-Rex actually had lips. We will always be limited by the evidence we have. For all we know, Jesus could have had a wife and kids. Unlikely, sure, but there's no evidence for it either way. In the absence of evidence, historians and scientists always lean towards what is most likely, but one can't help but be uncontent with such conclusions sometimes. What we know in science constantly changes. Sure, some fields of studies stagnate because there is little to no new discoveries or further research to be done, but a lot of what we know changes. What is considered a fact, therefore, changes depending on the current evidence we have, as well as our interpretation of that evidence. Think of ancient people who believed the earth was flat. I mean, in a way, it made sense. The sky moved, the sun sets, the moon rises. You could perhaps deduce that the sun and moon revolved around our world. Think about earlier dinosaur reconstructions. Spinosaurus, for instance. We know Jurassic Park 3's Spinosaurus to be inaccurate, but back then, when we had less samples and evidence, It was, in fact, rather accurate for its time. Spinosaurus, for those who may not know, is a great example of how our knowledge in science changes. One day you look at this giant bipedal crocodile terrorizing the swampy environment of North Africa. The next thing you know, Spinosaurus is actually a swimmer who walked on all fours. The next thing you know, it's actually a biped that acted like a duck. The next thing you know, it had this thing. Speaking of Spinosaurus, let's dive into the world of paleontology. Fossilization as a process is pretty rare. First, an organism needs to have bones or cartilage, as soft parts like flesh and organs obviously decompose over time. It has to be buried under very strict conditions, such as that it has to be buried in an oxygen-free environment protected from scavengers. Certain conditions after it has been buried also have to be met to ensure that it doesn't break. Contrary to what you might see in Jurassic Park, dinosaurs don't actually get preserved entirely. Sometimes we just get a skull or a vertebra. In the case of sharks, we only get teeth. And speaking of sharks, if you think there is a lot to be explored in our oceans, think of how much there is to discover in our oceans millions of years ago, in each evolutionary period. What about soft-bodied organisms that don't preserve, like jellyfish? What about parts of an organism that don't preserve? I mean, there's a reason why people debate whether or not T-Rex had lips. Dinosaurs could have had top hats for all we know, but there'd be no evidence for it, and thus no reason to believe it. How do you even reconstruct an ecosystem from the very distant past? We don't know every plant, rock, and animal that existed during a certain period, as well as the interactions in that ecosystem. There will always be gaps in history and science, gaps that might never actually be filled, at least not filled to the satisfactions of our strict and rigorous standards. I mean, for God's sakes, let's take the place of those weirdos at Ancient Aliens. What if there was in fact an ancient civilization that was more advanced than others? Or what if aliens had visited Earth and that their technology was so powerful that it left no trace of them? Now, I will say I don't really like engaging in those conversations because they tend to be at times intellectually irresponsible, since we tend to just assign aliens, or God for that matter, for things that we do not yet understand. Superstition and myths were used to be our way of explaining the unknown, but these were eventually replaced when humans developed a more empirically centered way of thinking. But anyways, that's all I have to say. It's fascinating yet terrifying just how little we are and how little we truly know about this world and of course the universe that we find ourselves in. Is it our responsibility to know everything? Or are we just forever driven in our quest for knowledge and understanding? A quest perhaps that we will never truly attain. I mean, I know for sure that I won't attain it. I won't learn all the things I want since, well, I'll die in less than 100 years. I won't get to see all the new technologies and discoveries that humans develop because, well, I just won't be there anymore. And that's sad, really.